Robinson reveals the story of the Devonshire coastal village of Clovelly.
A village by the sea, fishing boats, cottages and a gorgeous view. A perfect place to escape from a busy world. I'm Ben Robinson, and as an archaeologist I love to explore the places where we live, how they've changed, and hopefully dig up a few surprises about their past. When we think of our coastal villages, we often think of places that are remote, places of retreat, of relaxation, but they've been at the forefront of history. From the arrival of Christianity through desperate battles with neighbours and nature, from slave trading to the birth of the modern tourist industry. In the Victorian era, Clovelly in North Devon was on the front line of a social revolution, the dawning of the English seaside holiday. But it's much more than a quaint resort where little's changed. Clovelly may look frozen in time, but the village we see today is actually the creation of one powerful and pioneering woman. This is the story of how she transformed Clovelly from a down-at-hill fishing village to a romantic idyll. There's no doubt about it, fishing villages charm us, and they don't come much more enchanting than Clovelly in North Devon. With its whitewashed buildings tumbling down the cliffside, it's been called the Devonian Amalfi. Walking through this place is like taking steps back through time. There's very few traces of the modern world here, but there are one or two unusual features. For one thing, Clovelly is entirely privately owned, and you have to pay to come here. In days gone by, donkeys were used to transport heavy goods like slate, lime and fish. There's still a fixture here in the village, though these days they have a gentler life, entertaining tourists. One thing you won't find here is motor vehicles. They're banned, and that means a climb up this incredibly steep cobbled street. So why is Clovelly so perfectly preserved as a Victorian village? Why hasn't it, like so many other seaside villages on this stretch of coast, grown into a bigger, more modern resort? I'm starting my hunt for clues at the top of the hill, where Clovelly Court dominates the horizon. The manor of Clovelly is recorded in the Domesday Book of 1086. It included the village, a manor house, this wonderful church with Norman origins, and the whole thing was owned by the first Norman King of England, William the Conqueror. From William, the estate was passed to various royals, but in 1242 it was in private hands, and it's been owned by just 3 families since then. First the Giffords, then the Careys, then the Hamlins. But while the aristocracy lorded it out on the hill, it was down here in the harbour where things were really changing. If you look at the Domesday entry for Clovelly, it's all about who's farming the land, how many ploughs there are, how much woodland there is. There's nothing about the sea and nothing about this harbour. But as we move through the medieval period, trading becomes more important, fishing becomes more important, and the key to the success of this place is this magnificent harbour wall. Since the mid-1300s, this quay has been the focal point of the village, and you can still see signs of how it was built all those years ago. The Careys were lords of the manor here for around 400 years, and they were responsible for building this quay. William Carey, as early as the 14th century, probably built this section, and there's a little clue here, this straight joint. These massive boulders, one on top of the other, seem to denote the end of that first section of quay. George Carey then extended the quay this way in the 16th century. It was extended again and then raised in height, and this massive wall protects the boats inside the harbour. By the 1800s, fishing had become the primary industry in the village. Stephen Perham is a sixth-generation Clovelly fisherman. His family have fished here for more than 200 years. This is a great boat you got here, lovely old boat.
She is lovely. She's a picaroona.
A picker-water?
A picaroona. A picaroona. Clovelly herring boat, yeah? Comes from the Spanish picaroon for rogue or rascal, a sea robber.
But this wasn't for pirates.
No. She was for catching herrings, this is. There used to be big herring luggers. Used to work out of here, deep-keeled boats, 25, 30 foot long. And obviously when the tidal harbour like this, you've got to wait for the tide to get out. And then wait for it to get back in again before you can land the catch. So this boat was developed around the 1870s to get out quicker and steal a march on the bigger boats so they would get a better price for the fish.
So they knew what they were doing when they were building these things then?
Yeah, these boats were built for this coast. They were built for this particular harbour. Yeah, so they knew what they were doing.
Stephen is the very last person in Clovelly fishing for herring in the traditional way. Caught by hand in nets hung over the side of his faithful picaroona, he hasn't missed a season in over 35 years.
We fish in the same way they fished in Clovelly for probably, over 500 years. The methods I use are exactly the same as my grandfather and great-grandfather, would have fished with.
So presumably you stick an engine on it now and...
No.
No?
No, I still fish under sailor oar. Yeah, I row out there on this boat here.
Well, that seems like unnecessarily hard work to me.
No, it's keeping a tradition alive, isn't it? And it's what Clovelly was all built on. This whole village is built on the herring, on this particular boat.
Today, the harbour might be a peaceful spot, but in the mid-1800s it would have been a very different scene. Around 200 men working some 80 herring boats would have landed their catch here. You've got this romantic idea, you go out on the sea and it's all lovely, I mean, life must have been a bit tougher than that.
Life was very tough. Even today, it's not easy. Any bad weather, which you have to be aware of all the time, because you can't just put the motor on and come home. If no fish come over the side, you've got no money. Your life was completely difficult in those days. It's a hard place to make a living here. A hard place to make a living and a challenging place to live. The buildings were once tiny, dirty and falling apart. Behind the pristine facades of the cottages lie hidden clues revealing how the village was originally built. Now, many of these houses look very formal, very symmetrical, very regular, but here and there there's a wobbly wall, a rounded corner, and this is why. The early houses were built of a mixture of beach pebbles and cob, and cob's just earth and stones and straw mixed together, and the walls had to be thick to support the weight of the roofs. It was the simple materials they had to hand. Construction was basic, and so were the living quarters. This is Fisherman's Cottage, which visitors can look around. It's small enough as one house, but would have originally been two separate homes. Good grief, this is tiny. And one family would have occupied this room and the bedroom upstairs. But this is where the daily life took place. There's a range here, cooking, boiling things, drying clothes. That fire would have been continually on. Much of life would have taken place outside, out in the street, out in the yard. But when the weather was bad, when it was dark, this is where the family would assemble. And they would be crammed in here. I mean, cosy doesn't begin to describe it. So living conditions were cramped, and out on the streets things weren't nearly as lovely as they look today. Right there. This wonderful main street is like a river cascading down to the harbour, and it was actually created by a river. Clovelly means cleft or ravine in the hills, and imagine a great stream gouging out this winding route. Now, when the houses were built here, the stream continued to flow, and it was muddy, it was dirty, it was smelly. In fact, there was a cholera outbreak here. So they got these pebbles from off the beach and created this wonderful paving. And it's fantastic, a little bit slippery at times and a little bit hard on the feet. But imagine if it wasn't here, what a mess this street would be.
An uncertain income, tiny houses and dirty streets might have made life tough for the villagers in the 1800s, but the lords of the manor did little to help the great unwashed.
That was until 1884, when the Clovelly estate passed into the hands of a formidable young woman, the 28-year-old Christine Hamlin, or the Queen of Clovelly as she became known.
She had a vision to transform Clovelly into a romantic paradise and to turn around the fortunes of her villagers. Clovelly historian and village tour guide Jana Edwards has been fascinated by Christine Hamlin ever since she came here 10 years ago.
What did Christine actually do to improve the village?
She restored and renovated almost every cottage and farm. They had been historically living in tiny little dark dank hovels, and so she literally would take walls down and turn two little ones into a larger one and add stories on in some cases, making more rooms. A complete and utter change, in terms of a quality of life for the people that were going to live there. And then all the time keeping in mind how much she wanted to beautify it as well.
Evidence of Christine's transformation of Clovelly can be seen all along the main street.
See where you've got these gables at the top? Those were definitely added on. That whole other floor was added on top of that one. Prior to that, it would have just been a straight roof line, something very, very simple. Whenever she did a renovation or restoration, she would always put her initials on and date it, so there was never any confusion about who did what and when.
This isn't a fisherman's cottage, is it?
No, this is definitely not a fisherman's cottage. This is a very large cottage. Here again, she's added a floor and the balcony as well. Very different than what was there originally and had been there for centuries.
Oh, this is much more ornate, isn't it?
Yes, it's quite interesting. Christine Hamlin travelled a lot. She would find some architectural style she really liked or see it somewhere else in the country, and she would come back and put it on one of the cottages that she was renovating.
This one's been really tutored up, hasn't it?
Totally tutored up.
Christine was clearly a follower of the arts and crafts style that was popular at the end of the 1800s. Typically, buildings were made to look medieval by adding things like fake Tudor beams. These decorative details disguised Clovelly's origins as a basic fishing village and created a place that was much more refined. And that made it a hit with tourists. Today, Clovelly welcomes visitors from far and wide.
Isn't it extraordinary, all those years ago, and it's ended up with bringing people from across
all
the world.
over the world. And they are all amazed with Christine Hamlin and what she was able to accomplish and what this place is. I can't think of anywhere like this. This is truly a unique location and place.
The tourist trade in Clovelly isn't a modern phenomenon. Even while she was renovating her village, Christine had one eye on this emerging new industry. And there's one building that demonstrates that perfectly.
This is the new inn. There was already a new inn on the other side of the road, but it was too small. So at Christine's behest, a new one was opened. And she took 3 cottages, knocked them through, extended them, and gave them this sort of Tudor arts and craftsy makeover. Then she had somewhere that was big enough for the growing number of people that wanted to stay and enjoy her beautiful village.
Christine's renovations of Clovelly were all happening against a backdrop of huge social change. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, our transport systems were overhauled. Steam trains and steamships offered people brand new, affordable ways to travel.
But industrialisation came with a downside. Our cities were becoming dirty, crowded, smog-ridden places to be. People began to crave the clean air of the countryside to restore health and well-being.
None retreated from the grime of industrialisation more than our artists. Writer Charles Kingsley fed the national appetite for simpler times in a rural idyll by writing about Clovelly, a place he'd grown up in.
This is a description of Clovelly from the novel Westward Ho. So forth the two went, along the park to the eastward, and past the head of a little wood-embosomed fishing town, a steep stair of houses clinging to the cliff far below them, the bright slate roofs and white walls glittering in the moonlight. A steep stair of houses. That's Clovelly to a T.
Kingsley's novel was a bestseller and brought remote little Clovelly to a worldwide audience. And that audience wanted to come and see the place for themselves. Most arrived here by steamship. Dr. Mary Shannon is an expert on Victorian history and literature.
Well, we're not on a steamboat, but it seems that this is a pretty Victorian way to see Clovelly. I mean, it just looks fantastic.
Absolutely, and this is exactly when the Victorians wanted to come to Clovelly. The air is great, it smells great, the light is fantastic, you've got a beautiful view for your arrival.
But it's not too long before this that people are actively afraid of the sea, and yet people suddenly come flocking to it.
Yeah, well, things change a lot. Partly, transport gets a lot easier, so more people could travel and have a holiday. But also, actually, literary culture has an awful lot to do with it. So Charles Kingsley's really popular novel, Westward Ho, comes out in 1855, and it carries on being popular for a long time. And it's set in and around here, and it conjures up this idea of the sea as a kind of nautical adventure, somewhere romantic. And the Victorians really embraced this idea.
And that brought them flocking here to take what was a relatively new idea, a holiday. You could even get a tour operator to plan the whole thing for you.
Were these holidays just for the upper classes?
No, not at all. I mean, because transport had got so much easier, more and more Victorians could take advantage of the seaside and come away on holiday. Thomas Cook did guided tours to the seaside. It was much more something that the middling sorts, as the Victorians might call them, could be on the move. Some people only had 1 week a year, one precious week to come away.
I mean, you'd want to come somewhere pretty special if you just had that time, wouldn't you?
Absolutely, absolutely. And Christine Hamlin's work in making this place so special would have been integral, I think, in attracting people here.
The timing couldn't have been better for Christine's reinvention of Clovelly from a working fishing village to a romantic rural getaway. And that benefited her villagers too.
The influx of Victorian seaside lovers gave the villagers new ways to make money. Fishermen became tour guides, taking people on boat trips round the bay, and their wives made cream teas. It seemed like a win-win situation for everyone.
As fishing declined in Clovelly, tourism continued to rise throughout the Victorian era and beyond. But with the extra visitors came increasing problems. They needed facilities and took up space, something that was in short supply in Clovelly. True to form, Christine had a plan. The Honourable John Rouse is the current owner of the Clovelly estate and descendant of Christine Hamlin. The original manor house was all but destroyed in 2 big fires, but a rebuilt Clovelly court is still the family home.
So, what did Christine Hamlin think of all these tourists?
She was, I think, pleased to think that the village that she loved so much would be appreciated by many people from throughout this country and indeed further afield.
So visitors are starting to come in ever-increasing numbers. All this required some management.
Well, yes, but people had been coming to Clovelly and enjoying its beauty from the 1870s, and it was only in the interwar period that she decided that actually people were very frustrated by the difficulties in parking, and the worst thing in the world was to see a large number of cars dotted around the place.
And what was her solution?
So her solution was to acquire an area of land out of sight of the rest of the village so that people wouldn't have the view of serried ranks of cars. And in order to fund that, she had to sell one of her prized farms. So she sold a 200-acre farm and bought 20 acres of land from the church commissioners.
She must have really wanted that land. It doesn't sound like a great bargain, but absolutely vital for the preservation of the village.
Yeah. And it did exactly what she wanted. I made it comfortable for all our visitors to park their cars out of sight of the rest of the village, and then concentrated perhaps the commercial activities at the top of the village and left the village itself intact.
Christine kept meticulous records of how many vehicles were coming here every year in her notebooks, the Annals of Clovelly.
You'll notice in 1936 that there were just under 4,000 charabancs coming every year and nearly 50,000 cars.
Nearly 50,000 cars. That is absolutely incredible. Not everyone owns a car in the 30s, not by any means.
That's right.
They're turning up in droves.
Yeah, I think it's true that Clovelly then did change from being a fishing village to more of a tourist village, but I have been very anxious to preserve that fishing link for Clovelly.
Are you proud of Christine Hamlin?
Absolutely, and I think Clovelly would not have survived but for her enormous input into the whole village and her long-term vision.
While Christine's efforts made Clovelly even more popular, she had to spend vast sums of money making it happen. First, she worked her way through her husband's entire fortune, then sold swathes of family land. Long term, it paid off.
And this is the very same piece of land that Christine bought from the church for her car park. It's still the car park and visitor centre today. It's sectioned off from the village, it's separated from the village, it's hidden from view. But if you want to see Clovelly, you have to go through here.
It could so easily have been a very different story. Just a few miles along the coast is Westward Ho, another Victorian creation inspired by Charles Kingsley, but this one explicitly named after his book and purpose-built for the bucket and spade tourist trade.
With its steep hill and rocky beach, Clovelly was never destined for quite the same fate, but it could have easily fallen victim to unsympathetic development without Christine's fierce protection.
Christine died aged 80 in 1936. The epitaph on her grave, "I dwell among my own people," was added to a photograph and distributed amongst her residents. Her image still sits on many mantelpieces in the village. Today, Clovelly welcomes more tourists than ever. Last year, they numbered over 150,000. I'm keen to find out how that affects life for the residents. With no vehicle access, even everyday tasks like getting in the weekly food shop can be a challenge. But after 12 years of living here, Ellie Jarvis has got a few tricks up her sleeve.
I've seen these in pictures, old pictures, and I didn't think you were still using them.
Oh yes, we do. Everything gets sledged down to the houses. If we move house, the hotels, all the beer barrels, all that sort of thing, all gets sledged down.
We're going to swap over. If you go a bit wider on this bend.
Oh, right, there's a technique.
Well, yeah, because otherwise it'll tip.
All the shopping out.
Look up to the food.
Yeah, there's a technique.
That's it. You're doing well.
Ellie lives in one of the oldest and most distinctive buildings in the village, right down on the harbour front.
This is you?
Okay, this is it.
Ah,
Right,
excellent.
you put it right up as close as you can. Okay.
There we go.
Take a bag or two. Come on in.
Oh my goodness.
Mind your head.
Yes. Very low, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So you can put the shopping down there.
But lovely.
So this would have been the sail loft once upon a time. So the living quarters were above here. And in fact, I can show you. Let me just come over here.
Oh, now it makes sense. All the sails and nets and paraphernalia all come in without having to go upstairs.
Absolutely. They bring the boat alongside and then bring it all straight in. Yeah.
Can I see the rest of the house?
I'll show you the balcony.
Ellie's house is known as Crazy Kate's Cottage. It was named after Kate Lyle, who lived here in the early 1700s. Kate's husband was a fisherman, and she would watch him from her window as he fished in the bay. The story goes that one day a storm blew up, and he was drowned before her eyes. This terrible sight drove her mad. Many years later, being able to bear it no longer, she's said to have put on her wedding dress and walked into the sea to join her husband in his watery grave.
What a story. Do you think any of it's true?
Yeah, I'm sure it is actually. And they say that she's still here in the
Oh,
house.
really?
Absolutely.
And that doesn't
yeah.
freak you out to have
Not
a
at-
ghost here?
No, not at all. And my children blame her for everything that goes wrong and gets broken.
Very good. Absolutely splendid, this view. You're looking out on the world, but the world's also looking in on you. Does that get annoying? This must be the most photographed building in Clovelly.
I think it may well be actually, yeah. But okay, so sometimes visitors, they maybe come into the house, they think we're in costume.
Well, they
or-
walk right in.
Absolutely, they're expecting it to be a museum, perhaps, especially if there's a language barrier, they might not understand, but that's just part of it.
Clovelly might be a magnet for tourists, but you won't find a second home or a holiday home here. If you want to live here, you have to apply to the estate office, but that system works well for Ellie.
And you've lived in other places in the village as well, so you've got to try out different houses.
Absolutely, because it's a privately owned village and all the properties are rented. It means that as families change and grow and needs change, we move into all sorts. So I've lived in 3 of the cottages in Clovelly.
Which is the best?
Oh, well, here, of course, of course.
It's Clovelly's unusual status as a privately owned village populated by tenants that made it possible for Christine to renovate almost every building according to her own personal vision. But it's also meant that Clovelly has been protected as a living, working place right up to today.
Don't let anybody tell you this village is fake. Making this community work, this village work for visitors and the residents alike, fulfilling Christine Hamlin's vision is every bit as important as any industry that took place here in the past.